Gender Sabotage by Stacy, aka Sallydarity, from the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Daring, J. Rogue, Deric, Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. Quote, "Look how your children grow up, taught from the earliest infancy to curb their love natures, restrained at every turn. Little girls must not be tomboyish, must not go barefoot, must not climb trees, must not learn to swim. Little boys are laughed at as effeminate, silly girl boys if they want to make patchwork or play with a doll. Then, when they grow up, oh, men don't care for home or children as women do. Why should they, when the deliberate effort of your life has been to crush that nature out of them? Women can't rough it like men. Train any animal or any plant as you train your young girls, and it won't be able to rough it either. Now will somebody tell me why either sex should hold a corner on athletic sports? Why any child should not have free use of its limbs? These are the effects of your purity standard, your marriage law. This is your work. Look at it." End quote from Voltaire de Cleyre, Sex Slavery, 1890. Quote, "What makes me transgendered is that my birth sex, which is female, appears to be in social contradiction to my gender expression, which is read as masculine. I defend my right to that social contradiction. In fact, I want to live long enough to hear people ask, what made me think that it was a contradiction in the first place?" End quote from Leslie Feinberg's Trans Liberation, 1998. Anarcha-feminists and anarchists in general need to have some new discussions about gender. Feminism has had an ongoing internal argument regarding minimizing or maximizing the meanings of the differences between men and women. Now we are seeing the influence on many anarchists and feminists of newer ideas about gender, e.g., queer theory, that question the idea of a concrete concept of woman and man, even male and female. Yet some radical or anarchist feminists and lesbians remain stubborn about questioning the usefulness of a category called woman. Meanwhile, identity politics have come under fire in anarchist circles, often characterizing identity-oriented projects as homogeneous, represented only by each project's most vocal proponents, and dismissing the importance of focusing on opposition to gender, sexuality, class, or racial oppressions. Yet that which is called identity politics often does involve essentialism, the idea that there are essential differences between two groups. In the case of feminism, those who most often get to speak for the movement are white with class privilege, and regularly marginalize the experiences of women of color and poor women, and exclude transgender, transsexual people when they organize around a universal concept of women. The standard radical feminist characterization of the way gender oppression, patriarchy, works legitimizes women's exercise of domination through capitalism or white supremacy, etc., and makes men's domination seem natural and inevitable. If the criticism of identity politics is that it hardens identities, a queer theory-influenced anarcha-feminism then could be outside of this criticism, and indeed may share it, while still emphasizing the real effects of the group-based oppression. We've been made to believe that human subordination under the law is natural, that we need to be governed. The legitimacy of imposed government is also emphasized through the seemingly natural differences between people. The differences between people have been made significant so as to promote divisions based on domination and subordination. In doing so, those differences must become clear-cut. A border must be drawn between the two, creating a dichotomy so there is no confusion about who is where in the hierarchy. This takes time, centuries even, to really harden our perception of human nature. It takes laws, but worse, it takes discipline, primarily in the form of terror and violence, to pound a sense of hierarchy into us. Despite the possibility that the state and capitalism may be able to function without these imposed borders, the borders must still be destroyed. To achieve liberation, we must reject the binary gender system, which divides us into two mutually exclusive categories. This gender system not only oppresses in the form of a hierarchy of categories, but also in terms of gender expression, holding up masculinity as superior and policing each person into their gender box. The significance of gender/sex differences must be exposed as a political construct, one which has been used to form a cross-class alliance among men, and to make heterosexuality and women's roles in exploitation in and outside the home and family to seem natural. In effect, we are imprisoned by a gender binary, though a sort of freedom may be accessible to some, and if we don't behave appropriately, there are plenty of prison guards to attempt to put us in our place. Clearly, those who do not fit into these gender boxes are seen as a threat, and are disciplined through threats or acts of discrimination, verbal abuse, harassment, and/or violence. I argue not that gender transgression or deviance is in itself revolutionary, but that we must transcend or destroy the gender-based power relations as part of a sort of decolonizing. It is crucial that feminists not reinforce these gender boxes, but also that anarchists not minimize our need to pull these issues from the margins. The existence of these identities created by power relations should not be denied, but instead should be examined and opposed in the context of power. Whereas sex is usually defined by biological differences, gender has been used to describe the prescribed social differences between female and male, defining us as feminine or masculine, traits we can generally agree are not universal throughout time or place. One point of contention among some feminists and gender transgressors, not that the two are mutually exclusive, is a definition of gender. I agree with others like Kate Bornstein that gender may refer to different concepts, gender roles, gender identity, etc. For lack of a better term, here I will use the term gender stratum to refer to the hierarchical binary categories of gender. I argue that what is called gender identity is a different aspect of gender, which is separate from, but related to, gender stratum. Gender identity, which I would call gender inclination, since identity is problematic here, would have different meaning without gender stratum, but should not be confused as meaning the same thing, despite the fact that the two are conflated by many feminists. We can probably agree that gender stratum is an imposed social construct. We could take it further by questioning whether our concepts of the biological differences between female and male existed before hierarchy, and whether they at least had the same significance before Western culture interpreted the differences we understand today. The possibility that there are really no natural differences between the sexes, that these sexes don't exist, other than because of political and social reasons, can be troublesome to nearly anyone. In many ways, these ideas exist almost exclusively in the realm of academia, and have little relevance to most people's everyday lives. On the other hand, throughout the time humans have existed, there have been diverse ideas about the meanings of the physical differences between those with different organs associated with sex and gender. In considering the experiences of intersex people and transgender and transsexual people, it only makes sense that a gender-sex continuum should be the basis for an understanding of human nature. Different ideas about gender and sexuality in various cultures, mostly where untouched by Western civilization, show us that not only are Western dualistic ideas about gender, sex, sexuality, and accompanying hierarchy are atypical and manipulated to manage the people, but also that the argument that modern capitalism accommodates transgressive gender and expressions of sexuality is beside the point. The transition to capitalism was indeed a main driving force of the conquest over different forms of gender expression and sexuality, enforcing a strict gender-sex binary. The likelihood is minimal that we could fully understand the origins of the concept of sex or the beginnings of gender hierarchy, even though this may provide answers about the origins of hierarchy itself. Whether biological characteristics once had neutral meaning or not, significance has been increasingly placed on these differences, creating these sex-gender constructs as part of a hierarchy. Sex is gendered, and therefore I use the two terms somewhat interchangeably. And the construction of the divisions between men and women has been an ongoing process. Woman as a different species. Quote, certainly we can say that the language of the witch hunt produced the woman as a different species. End quote by Silvia Federici. To understand the construction of a gender binary and hierarchy, we primarily look at Europe because of the ways in which, through colonization and imperialism, Europe violently exported its ideas throughout the world. Before the witch hunts, European peasant women, having a decent amount of social power despite sexual division of labor and Christian-promoted misogyny, were heavily involved in revolts against feudalism and, later, capitalism. It is no coincidence, as Silvia Federici describes in her book, Caliban and the Witch, that the witch hunts, which involved the torture and murder of hundreds of thousands of women, mostly in the 16th and 17th centuries, occurred in conjunction with the transition to capitalism and the colonization of the Americas. Federici also explains how, over the course of a few centuries, women's exploitation, through their unpaid labor in the home, termed reproduction, which includes procreation but is not limited to it, as well as slave labor in the Americas, had to be constructed as natural in the setting in which it was in the interest of capitalism to be viewed as voluntary and contractual. By justifying their exploitation, the dehumanization of unpaid laborers, women, allowed capitalists to hide and legitimize the reality that people didn't have a choice in the matter. The witch hunts were not only counterinsurgency measures. Accusations of witchcraft and prostitution were often made to punish theft and attacks, real or invented, on property, which increased at this time due to land privatization and the exclusion of women from receiving wages. Especially important was capitalism's new demand for workers, partly due to population crisis, leading to the construction of monogamous heterosexual marriage as natural through the forced dependence of women on men, and criminalization of sexual acts that are not for the purpose of reproduction. Peasant women increasingly began to get punished for crimes such as abortion and contraception, and, in the case of witches, also for allegedly causing infertility and impotence in men, in addition to castration and killing children. Queer peasants were disciplined by means of terror in Europe in particular. This is where the term faggot, meaning kindling, came from, but also during colonization of the Americas, as homosexuals and two-spirit people were killed, and the continuation of these identities and practices were averted or forced underground. Federici stresses that while some peasant men participated in and even encouraged these actions against women, and while the church played a strong role, the greater part of the campaign of terror against women would not have been possible without the role and interest of the state. The ruling class's interest in promoting the differences between the sexes is clear, and they accomplished this task by punishing certain behaviors and using terror to discipline women. Early on, European women were defined as unruly, mentally weak, and in need of being controlled. The witch hunt served to reinforce this, but at the same time to discipline women into a new nature, that the docile, moral, and motherly, yet still in need of being controlled. It is worth noting that while capitalism played a strong role in shaping what became understood as the nature of women, there are obvious examples of how those in power in any economic circumstances, not just capitalism, seek to justify their rule by different means, often by controlling sexuality and enforcing gender norms. So while the concept of women and men as two different groups existed prior to the witch hunts, there is now a new significance in the difference between the two, functioning as a clear binary. The notion of inflexible divisions between humans had to be beaten into all the people as a whole, thus creating profound alienation between men and women, and marginalization, if not extermination, of those who deviate from the norms. In addition, to compel the people to work under the conditions that capitalism requires, involved a sort of conquest involving a new perception of the body as a machine or tool, and through the criminalization of various communal activities, and non-productive sexuality. Worker subordination and women's further subordination were made to seem natural. Even though there seems to be no anti-capitalist historical study of the shaping of men, this clearly was part of the witch hunts, the transition to capitalism, and colonialism as well. In discussing human nature, we need to be critical of the ways that certain concepts such as hierarchy or a need for hierarchy are made to seem natural. For instance, Andrea Smith wrote, quote, "Heteropatriarchy is essential for the building of U.S. empire. Patriarchy is a logic that naturalizes social hierarchy. Just as men are supposed to naturally dominate women on the basis of biology, so too should the social elites of a society naturally rule everyone else through the nation-state form of governance that is constructed through domination, violence, and control." End quote. In a speech, she said, quote, "This is why in the history of Indian genocide, the first task that the colonizers took on was to integrate patriarchy into native communities. The primary tool used by colonists is sexual violence. What sexual violence does for colonialism and white supremacy is render women of color inherently rapeable, our lands inherently invadable, and our resources inherently extractable." End quote. An example of colonization in the New World being accomplished partly through the promotion of sexual divisions is the French Jesuits' interactions with natives in Canada, called the Montagnais Naskapi. With no sense of private property, authority, or male superiority, which according to the French had to change if they were to become reliable trade partners. The French taught Naskapi men to discipline their children and to bring their women to order. Witch hunts occurred in parts of the Americas. Federici discusses Mexico and Peru that demonize all natives and Africans, but often focus more on the women. Colonization is an ongoing process, which includes patriarchal indoctrination and sexual violence in Indian schools. Gender stratum and race. The sex-gender hierarchy is inseparable from race, colonization, and capitalism. For example, female slaves are treated pretty much the same as male slaves, up until importing slaves was made illegal, at which time female slaves were made more often to breed and were increasingly subject to the sexual violence of white men. Aspects of femininity, defined here as culturally and socially dictated as appropriate for real women, were constructed as a distinguishing mark of class and race, much like landscape yards that demonstrate that the owners need not use their land to grow food. Women who didn't have to work were to be unnaturally weaker, delicate, dependent, lily white, housebound, and therefore the making of the white race involved the politicized unmaking of women to fit into white. Race is also a political and social construct. Understanding one political social construction can help us better understand another. Bacon's Rebellion, which is a more significant one of many rebellions in which European indentured servants and African slaves joined together, frightened the state of Virginia into passing a series of laws specifically outlining the freedoms accessible to Europeans and Christians versus Africans. In doing so, they created race. Quote, "Slavery was the most profitable form of labor in colonial Virginia, but racial slavery was a solution to the threat of servile insurrection and the problem of how to efficiently and peacefully get the workers, slave and free, to work. Race emerged from the needs of the Virginia upper class to craft a docile and productive labor force. But as the benefits of whiteness became apparent to English laborers, they came to embrace a system by which privileges were conferred in exchange for policing slaves." End quote. While prejudices and ideas about superiority based on differences existed prior, this invention of whiteness created a new significance on physical differences that had a particular function to form a cross-class alliance among white people which still exists today. The shaping of the categories of race and sex was part of a longer history of hierarchy. Additionally, just as a specific area of the witch hunts lasted a couple of centuries, so too is the construction of race an ongoing process. Like in the example of the Irish not being included into whiteness until later. Also, After the Civil War, lynching was a prominent way to terrorize, to discipline, black people into submission. Quote, before lynching could be consolidated as a popularly accepted institution, however, its savagery and its horrors had to be convincingly justified. These were the circumstances which spawned the myth of the black rapist, for the rape charge turned out to be the most powerful of several attempts to justify the lynching of black people, end quote, wrote Angela Davis. She explains further in her book, Women, Class, and Race, quote, however irrational the myth may be, it was not a spontaneous aberration. On the contrary, the myth of the black rapist was a distinctly political invention, end quote. This also contributed to white women's fear of black men, and to white men's fear of the property, women, becoming tarnished, and was part of the precedent set which began to criminalize people of color, leading to high rates of people of color in U.S. prisons today. Despite there being major limitations to drawing parallels between race and gender stratum, the construction of these dichotomies allows us to see partly how hierarchy functions. Those in power divide the people on the basis of a physical difference, ignoring exceptions and gray areas, and amplify the significance of these differences through criminalization and limitations of legal and economic freedoms, as well as through violence, justified by the alleged transgressions, while affording the favored group, men and whites, freedom from most repression. This process functions to make natural the divisions and hierarchical positions of those it involves. A cross-class alliance, rewarded with privileges, undermines anti-authoritarian resistance and class solidarity. In the case of women, I should point out that the male privilege includes man's ability to dominate the women in his family, which can be seen as more personal while being, in effect, political. Gender liberation for everyone. The naming of political advantages or wages of whiteness or maleness as privileges is a problem, however. If the way I described hierarchy's functioning is accurate, it would not really be in the interest of the favored working class group to participate in an alliance with the rich rulers, since that means they will perpetually be ruled and exploited. This is where the promise of mostly unattainable upward mobility comes in to reinforce the alliance. White people have a responsibility to us and themselves to abolish whiteness for these reasons, and to be fully human. In addition, of course, to the responsibility to end racism. Similar to the end of white people, when men participate in domination, they do themselves harm. While folks assigned male at birth, who don't comfortably fit into their assigned gender box, are certainly affected by gender oppression, the ones who do conform, willingly or not, would also benefit from undermining the ways gender hierarchy has been naturalized to the socialization of boys and men. They can hardly be free, and the relationships they have with others cannot be fulfilling as long as emotions are suppressed. Competitive masculinity has to be established, and inequality, if not abuse, must be maintained with women, and often children as well. Yet why would men choose to change if they are consistently told they are privileged? Bell Hooks asks. To change means, for one, that men would have to overcome their training to deny their emotions. Implicating women as well as men in perpetuating this damage done to males through parenting, Hooks writes, quote, homophobia underlines the fear that allowing boys to feel will turn them gay, end quote. Whereas feminism tends to imply a fight by and for women, it is then also in the interest of men to oppose gender oppression and homophobia and heteronormativity, rather than perpetuate it. It also means that feminism, for lack of a better word, must also address the situation of men. While it is clear that men largely benefit from the system while women do not, it clearly functions by enforcing this gender border along with the concepts man and woman. We must not then continue to reinforce these false concepts as binary, essential, stable, and universal categories. Clearly, even though viewing women as a socially constructed gender sex within a hierarchy is useful, caution must be taken to avoid a sort of essentialism or sense of universal experience of the suppressed group. Some feminists who see sex and gender as a hierarchical social construct do not accept any other definition of gender, which leads to major disagreements over gender identity. Some might argue that a realization of gender fluidity, rather than a dichotomy, would perhaps accomplish the task of undermining the political construction of gender and sex categories for the purpose of domination. This deserves further examination. If we argue, as some have, that hierarchical binaries like man, woman, and white and black are created to naturalize hierarchy, this implies that a hierarchy existed prior. Therefore, while it may have been less acceptable to people, this hierarchy existed nonetheless. So the task is surely not to simply abolish the binaries and constructs. Yet again, there is only so much we can know about the origins of the concept of man and woman, aside from the ways in which they have more recently been made more significant. In this argument for rejecting the binary gender system, it should not be understood to mean that no one should identify as a man or a woman, much less that we should vaguely smash gender or implement some utopian androgyny. A truly liberatory position on gender and sex requires self-determination of gender identity and inclination, including bodily alterations, and freedom from coercive gender assignment. Everyone's experiences and sense of identity should be incorporated into an idea of what gender means. One's inclination for femininity, in people assigned male or female at birth, for example, should not be dismissed or devalued by others who don't relate to it. Additionally, most trans people face dangers if they diverge much from the standard ideas of femininity and masculinity, and therefore have to pass by conforming in order to survive, by maintaining safety and employment, despite critical awareness by many about gender hierarchy and heterosexism. That said, we need to dismantle gender stratum, to separate the power dynamics attached to gender, in that masculinity often means domination and femininity subordination. Since men are taught to be dominating, that this is equated with masculinity being a real man, we need to make a particular point to change this. Men are denied their emotions, and as Bell Hooks writes, quote, patriarchy both creates the rage in boys and then contains it for later use, making it a resource to exploit later on as boys become men. As a national product, this rage can be garnered to further imperialism, hatred, and oppression of women and men globally. End quote. At the very least, it teaches men in general to be apathetic about the plight of others, because it instilled in men that their nature requires them to be dominating. We must extract the domination imperative from what it means to be a man. Hooks distinguishes patriarchal masculinity from masculinity, and this deserves further consideration. Without the naturalization of a man-woman dichotomy, masculinity and femininity, gender inclination, and all their various meanings are either exposed as social only and/or as more about individual tendencies of personality and affinity. It is this domination that should be opposed, no matter who is doing it or in what form. No one ought to identify domination as part of who they are, nor should women excuse their own or other women's participation in domination just because they believe they cannot be oppressors. This applies to male privilege, hetero privilege, class privilege, white privilege, etc., in addition to hierarchies perhaps inadvertently created by those judging others as not revolutionary, queer, or gender nonconforming enough. In the past, there was an expectation that the radical lesbian movement, and before that, women's suffrage, would strongly threaten the dominant order. In fact, it has been viewed as a threat, but as we can see, it has been defeated, recuperated, or co-opted under the larger system of domination. If much of radical feminism and lesbianism was really the only real threat to the system, then it served the dominant order to marginalize the particularly militant tendencies, and or those of women of color, or divert the movements to re-embrace essentialism, which reinforced the order of things. Some radical feminists were certainly on to something. According to Celestine Ware, a black woman activist in 1970, who was quoted in Bell Hooks' Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, quote, radical feminism postulates that the domination of one human being by another is a basic evil in society. Dominance in human relationships is the target of their opposition. End quote. And Hooks comments, quote, as feminist movement progressed, critiques of the notion of power as domination and control were submerged as bourgeois activists began to focus on women overcoming their fear of power. The implication being that if they wanted social equality with men, they would need to participate equally in exercising domination and control over others. End quote. Attributing violence and abuse to the nature or necessary political position of men gives women the opportunity to participate in domination while insisting that they can do so in a more ethical way, or that they are by definition incapable of participating in domination. In addition, this attitude makes male violence seem inevitable and allows us to avoid critical thinking about systemic and institutional oppressions, such as the likelihood that capitalism and the state promote rape. If rape is natural to men, then the survivors, mostly women, can rationalize that their only recourse is through the state. Yet prisons and police are not the solution to this problem. In addition, acknowledging that being a woman, queer, or transgressing gender boxes, and or having feminist or anarchist politics does not make one necessarily incapable of being a perpetrator of abuse and sexual assault. We must see this as a larger project of addressing issues of consent. Additionally, uniting around the freedom to choose what will be done or not done to or with our bodies ties together many people's struggles. As far as identity politics go, there must be some focus on identity in the sense that there are very real effects of these unreal constructs. Yet the point is to understand the gender and race divisions, not only to end gender and race oppression, but to end domination totally, to undermine these cross-class alliances created in the process of power seeking to naturalize itself, its law, and its divisions. Certainly capitalism, with the state, made the divisions between genders and races politically significant in a way that they never had been before. This shows that much of the racism and sexism that has existed in the last few centuries is not innate, not organic, not grassroots, but rather manufactured. Part of this struggle being exposing the ways in which our beliefs have been shaped in the interest of power, that many of the things we consider to be natural are in fact not just man-made, but state-made. Illuminating the ways that our oppression is not natural can be done partly through the actual demonstrations and experiences of gender fluidity and queerness, sometimes referred to with other concepts as queer. Quote, queer is an identity that problematizes the manageable limits of identity. Queer is a territory of tension, defined against the dominant narrative of white hetero-monogamous patriarchy, but also by an affinity with all who are marginalized, otherized, and oppressed. End quote, from the Mary Nardini gangs toward the queerist insurrection. In the sense that queer is unstable and destabilizing, it has much potential. Clearly, the refusal to participate in privileging political relations would not be co-opted. We know that LGBTQ is co-opted just as feminism is, and therefore, the potential lies in the ways in which queer is not co-optable. Where identity politics seeks inclusion for its respective group, it chooses participation and domination and reinforces binaries. Would a rejection of inclusion and participation be the antithesis of identity politics, even if it were a politics that focused on a specific group-based oppression? Gender transgression alone may or may not succeed at destroying the gender hierarchy. If it does, it is because it is able to render the binary meaningless. Yet few are so optimistic about this possibility, since it would probably require a lot of participation and clear intent because of this co-optability of transgressions of gender and sexuality by the power structure. However, I argue that binary gender and compulsory heterosexuality have to be destroyed because they relegate us all into our gender and sexuality boxes, limiting our ability to be liberated and to participate in resistance. It is necessary to come up with new ways of resisting gender oppression and patriarchy without reinforcing the idea that women is a useful category to organize around. Finally, the exposure of gender and sex as a social construct on which a binary hierarchy was naturalized and functions through cross-class and race alliances may activate a clearer general understanding of how this occurs, thereby allowing white women, for example, to better see how whiteness functions similarly, crumbling multiple constructs at once. Imagining new possibilities for gender, race, and power and economic relations is necessary for liberation.